Thank you, John, for a sobering and sober, but I think extremely thought-provoking speech. This is going to be followed now by a talk that I think will carry on with some of the same themes and questions from Ned Alpers. Ned is a professor of history at UCLA. He also taught in Dar es Salaam in the late 1960s, and I believe that met Eduardo and Janet there. And he has also been active in the United States in various forms of support and solidarity work. It was mentioned this morning that in a situation where the US government was, to put it mildly, not very supportive of the liberation struggle, that people-to-people solidarity organizations were really very important. So I think it's important to flag that Ned was involved in this. And he is currently also involved with the Association of Concerned African Scholars. Moving to his scholarly works, his first and best-known book is called Ivory and Slaves in East Africa, and is a book that is extremely well known. He also wrote a book about Walter Rodney, revolutionary and scholar. And for those of you who don't know, Walter Rodney was a Guyanan radical revolutionary who also was in Dar in that same period, and I think was very important in some ways in weaving together connections between Caribbean and African progressives. And Walter Rodney, alas, belongs to the long line of statesmen who were referred to this morning who were assassinated. So I think Ed's book is an important recording of that life. Presently, Ned is doing research on the history of Islam in the north of Mozambique, but he combines doing historical work with also reflecting on current politics and trends in Mozambique. And the title of his talk today is Can Mozambique Reinvent Itself? Challenges of National Development in the 1990s. So, Ned.
Well, thank you very much. As I really just want to, without repeating all the words, just to subscribe to what John Saul said. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to be here, to see the Underground Railway monument, and to be reminded, and then to hear that Frederick Douglass spoke in the first church. This is a historic place, and I think it's appropriate that we're having this historic meeting here. And also to Al, who has just sort of pulled together with a team of supporters this quite remarkable event. You will find, it depends on how you want to read this, that either some of my thunder has been stolen, my toes stepped on a little bit, but there are quotes that you're going to hear again that both the foreign minister and John Saul, who was as he said, we were neighbors at the University of Dar es Salaam. So, you know, this is just to kind of reinforce some of the messages. This afternoon, I want to talk about the changes that have affected Mozambique since the signing of the Rome Peace Accord in 1992, and the direction in which I think Mozambique is headed as we approach the new millennium. I will do so by addressing my comments first to Mozambique's new strategies for economic development, and then to the record of its young democracy in action. The title of my talk asks the question, can Mozambique reinvent itself? By which I mean to highlight the radical transformations taking place in Mozambique today. I characterize these changes as a process of reinvention because they involve abandoning a one-party political system and commitment to development of a socialist society for multi-party democracy and capitalism under Western schooling. While such radical change is not restricted to Mozambique in today's post-Cold War international environment, it is as bold a reconceptualization of national destiny as it would be for the leaders of the United States to embrace communism and turn to China for expert guidance. There is a special irony in this situation because it is occurring under the leadership of the same political party, Frelimo, that from 1962 led the liberation struggle against Portuguese colonialism and has governed Mozambique since independence in 1975. Independence gave a new sense of direction to the idea of Mozambique, as witnessed by the very title of Eduardo Mondlane's seminal book, The Struggle for Mozambique. Here, let me quote from the opening paragraph to Mondlane's important chapter on the new Mozambique, since it provides a bridge to the situation facing Mozambique today. Remember, he was writing this in 1968. Quote, "One of the chief lessons to be drawn from nearly 4 years of war in Mozambique is that liberation does not consist merely of driving out the Portuguese authority, but also of constructing a new country, and that this construction must be undertaken even while the colonial state is in the process of being destroyed. We realized this in principle before we began fighting, but it is only in the development of the struggle that we have learned quite how rapid and comprehensive civil reconstruction must be," end quote. Perhaps the most bitter lesson of independence is how difficult a task this has proved to be. The Mozambique towards which Eduardo Mondlane and Frelimo struggled in the 1960s and 1970s was a socialist society. In an interview with Aquino de Bragança, late director of the Centro de Estudos Africanos at Eduardo Mondlane University, Mondlane indicated Frelimo's steady movement towards a Marxist-Leninist definition of socialism. Quote, "Why? Because the conditions of life in Mozambique, the type of enemy which we have, does not give us any other alternative. Frelimo is inclining itself more and more in this direction because the conditions to which we struggle and work demand it," end quote. And of course, that's from John's introduction to the second edition of The Struggle for Mozambique. Later in the same interview, Mondlane made the additional points that it would be, quote, impossible to create a capitalist Mozambique, and ridiculous for people to struggle, for the people to struggle, to destroy the economic structure of the enemy and then reconstitute it in such a way as to serve the enemy, end quote. We've just heard John Saul discuss the rise and fall of Mozambican socialism. Today, whether or not you believe that all the conditions have changed, a new reality surely prevails. Frelimo has embraced the structural adjustment program imposed on it by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. How might this new direction affect the future development of Mozambique? Throughout the 1990s, the IMF and World Bank have dominated the economic development of Mozambique. From the beginnings of despair at the downward spiral their war-torn economy was taking in the 1980s, Frelimo steadily found itself having to come to grips with a post-war, post-apartheid, and post-Cold War set of realities. Practically speaking, the government had little choice but to turn to the IMF, World Bank, and the government donors that endorsed their policies, as even so conservative a magazine as The Economist acknowledges. For its pains, Mozambique has earned international recognition as a model African success story, a showcase for IMF and World Bank structural adjustment policies. At the end of 1997, an especially exuberant news service story proclaimed that Mozambique, quote, "a no-hope African basket case. This scrap heap of Marxist dreams is suddenly an example for Africa," end quote. At the same time, Mozambican President Joaquim Chissano noted that, quote, "our country is mentioned the world over with admiration and respect as an example. Transition from an economy stagnated by war, which destroyed infrastructures, pitting brother against brother, to a dynamic economy where the spirit of national reconciliation and solidarity prevails is a matter of national pride," end quote. And when United States Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rubin visited Maputo on a 5-nation tour of Africa this past July, he declared enthusiastically, "Now the challenge is economic liberation. Before it was freedom. Sustainability is the challenge," end quote. At the same time, adoption of this development strategy has caused many of Frelimo's staunchest allies on the left to criticize the Frelimo government for abandoning its historic commitment to social justice and to lambaste the IMF and World Bank for imposing retrograde policies on Mozambique. Most vocal among these critics is Joseph Hanlon, who suggests provocatively that as a consequence of implementing these policies, quote, "Mozambique seems to be heading back to its colonial past," which is kind of a different version of the quote John gave us earlier. Hanlon's disturbing vision is not shared by everyone on the left, but there is certainly an emerging consensus among critics across the political spectrum that structural adjustments causes as much, if not more, harm than good. To understand both of these perspectives, the positive and negative, let's take a look at some examples of how structural adjustment has played itself out in Mozambique during the 1990s. The basic idea of these policies is to curb inflation by devaluating and stabilizing the currency in order to create a favorable financial climate for investment, in the belief that in a global market system, these policies will ultimately lead to national development. The road to fiscal stabilization involves austerity programs that mainly affect the public sector of the economy, including education and health, liberalizing external trade and commodity prices, removing food subsidies, and privatization of state and parastatal enterprises. In the case of Mozambique, which as recently as 1994 the World Bank ranked as the poorest country in the world, the situation was severely compounded by the devastating social costs of the war waged by Renamo against the government and by debilitating international debt of more than $7 billion with nominal annual debt payments that amounted to 466% of annual earnings. Yet even the doomsayers would probably agree that at the macroeconomic level, the situation had begun to improve dramatically by the end of last year. Although Mozambique still has to regain its pre-war economic levels of the early 1980s, and that's really an important fact to remember, final figures for 1997 indicate, for example, that GDP grew by 12%, inflation has declined from a level of 70% in 1994 to 6.5%, the Metical, Mozambique's national currency, appears to have stabilized after devaluation of about 3,000% since the late 1980s and actually gained value relative to other regional currencies last year. Exports increased by 4% while imports declined slightly, with self-sufficiency in food considered an achievable goal in the near future. Annual per capita GDP increased to about $150, although Mozambique still ranks as one of the most impoverished nations in the world, and foreign investment has increased to more than $2 billion. Further evidence of its increased economic health, at least according to those who praise the path it has taken, is the unprecedented debt relief package that Mozambique has negotiated through the heavily indebted poor countries, the HIPC initiative of the IMF and World Bank. When the agreement signed in April is implemented in June 1999, Mozambique's external debt will be reduced from its present level to $1.1 billion, which is less than 200% of its export earnings, or at least projected export earnings, and should reduce its debt service ratio to below 20%, with a prediction by the IMF of below 10% by 2002. Still, I must mention that the top leaders of Mozambique's government all have stated publicly that they would have preferred complete debt forgiveness. This was mentioned by Foreign Minister Simão last night, and also when he mentioned that President Chissano was just in Jamaica, which got a cheer from the Jamaicans, but President Chissano wasn't speaking only about Mozambique. What he was calling for in this meeting at Jamaica was for all third world countries to band together and push for complete debt forgiveness. So there's a kind of a steady drumbeat here now that the HIPC has been signed. For its part, the Frelimo government has committed itself to redirecting the resources that will be regained from this process towards social investment and alleviating poverty. And again, that's what the foreign minister said yesterday. Meanwhile, significant new foreign investment is finding its way to Mozambique. In early June, Presidents Chissano and Nelson Mandela attended the opening ceremony for the greatly anticipated Maputo Development Corridor that links the port of Maputo to the Witbank area of South Africa. This new international road is considered to be one of the largest infrastructure projects in the continent, and hopes are high that, quote, many industries will be created along the way, which means extra money entering the national economy, end quote. The corridor project also signals the emergence of South Africa as the leading foreign investor in Mozambique, replacing Portugal. One such industry will be an iron and steel works in Maputo that is estimated to cost some $2 billion upon completion in 2003. It will be built by the South African Development Corporation with the anticipated involvement of American, European, and Japanese partners. Similar developments are taking place in other parts of the country. So much for the good news. What has been the price? At the national policy level, the IMF and World Bank have been widely criticized, not simply for imposing their own vision of the world economy on Mozambique, but especially for not consulting in any meaningful way with civil society. Critics contend that structural adjustment is a top-down reconfiguration of the Mozambican economy with very little Mozambican input. Many analysts have also chastised the IMF and World Bank for prescribing policies for Mozambique in isolation from the rapidly changing regional economy of Southern Africa. For example, critics point to the destruction of the recently privatized cashew processing industry, which has been strangled by a combination of progressive tariff reductions on raw cashew exports to India, the world's leading producer of processed cashews, and severe restrictions on credit for domestic investors that make plant modernization impossible to achieve. Several thousand workers, nearly all of them women, have consequently lost their jobs, and peasant producers have not reaped the promised profits from increased exports to India. The Cashew Fiasco has attracted particular attention because it exposes serious struggles within the World Bank over larger issues, such as local consultation, control of decision-making about the direction of national development policy, and the practical consequences of such policies. New World Bank President James Wolfenson visited Mozambique in February 1997 and, after listening to these criticisms, ordered a new study to be made of the cashew industry by American consulting firm Deloitte & Touche, which, when it was released the following September, contradicted everything upon which World Bank policy had been based. Yet, despite a freeze on further liberalization of the export tax, the World Bank has not reversed its cashew policy for Mozambique. To my mind, the most damning criticism in this business is the following account of what transpired at a closed meeting with World Bank representatives. Quote, one Mozambican official said privately, and that's a quote, now a quote within the quote, the World Bank told us we must say this is our policy, and to stop saying it is imposed by the bank. We know aid is conditional upon World Bank approval, and now we must lie to get World Bank approval. And we will. But we remain totally opposed to a policy that will destroy our cashew industry, end quote. Another prime example of a failed World Bank program is the so-called ROCS, Road and Coastal Shipping Policy, which began in 1992. Former World Bank representative in Mozambique, Roberto Chavez, opposed ROCS and publicly stated that its level of capital intensity produced trunk roads that Mozambique could not maintain. Chavez cited the Nacala-Nampula Highway, the principal road in northern Mozambique, which already requires resurfacing only 4 years after its completion, commenting, quote, the roads have gone, but the debt remains. In a statement to a committee of the National Assembly, Minister of Public Works and Housing, Roberto White, declared flatly that ROCS is unsustainable. Although hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent, Mozambique still does not have a viable trunk road network, while the feeder roads upon which the entire rural system of commerce necessarily depends has been completely neglected. These two examples of failed, or at least questionable, World Bank projects help us to understand why late November 1997 attacks in the National Assembly compelled Industry Minister Oldemiro Baloy to admit that Mozambique has, quote, lost its sovereignty to the World Bank. A few days later, Prime Minister Pascoal Makumbi gave a press conference that criticized the World Bank for imposing policies that are not in our interest and sought support from President Wolfenson, quote, to help design policies that better correspond to our reality. Other broad areas of concern in Mozambique involve the social costs of structural adjustment. Specifically, this means delaying progress towards universal primary education until 2010, slower reconstruction of the war-torn health system, the continuation of a situation in which more than half the population live below the United Nations defined level of absolute poverty, high levels of unemployment, and a widening gap between rich and poor. Despite the fact that most of the dispossessed in Mozambique have no voice of their own at the national level, the Roman Catholic Church, certain NGOs, and academics from Eduardo Mondlane University have spoken forthrightly on the problems posed to national development by persistent poverty and the widening gap in wealth. At a meeting last July with 6 visiting IMF executive directors in Maputo, Graham Saul, who it turns out is John's nephew, of Oxfam, this is all very incestuous, is reported to have put these claims at their bluntest. Quote, in real terms, economic growth in Mozambique is zero, he said. People living in the richer suburbs of Maputo were certainly better off, he said, and suggested that what has really happened is a redistribution of wealth in the wrong direction, a transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, end quote. John couldn't have said it better himself. Meanwhile, others question whether the terms of HIPC will result in genuinely sustainable debt levels. There's a whole debate about what constitutes sustainability here, that enable the government to fulfill its commitment to gradually transfer resources to the social sector. The most vocal constituency on these issues are urban workers and trade unions. At this year's May Day celebrations in Maputo, the parade theme was for greater justice in the redistribution of wealth. One banner proclaimed, Chisano, we're tired of starvation wages. Another cried, no to wage inequalities between Mozambicans and foreigners. One group of workers asked, is privatization a sign of development or does it mean the suffocation of many families? Mocking Frelimo's 1994 campaign slogan for a better future, still another pleaded, is this the better future? Even President Chisano, who has maintained his personal popularity throughout this period, came under fire when Maputo City Council workers sang, "Chissano, you're starving us to death with these low wages." Now, to his credit, President Chissano accepted this torrent of criticism in good spirit, commenting afterwards that, quote, "This was one of the best May Day parades in recent years." As a demonstration that freedom of expression is alive and well in Mozambique, his optimism is certainly justified. But the comments themselves are sad testimony to the hurtful impact of structural adjustment. My own observations of Maputo a year ago bear witness to the enormous gap between rich and poor, with the former segment of the population, including both foreigners and the new class of Mozambican rich, most of whom have connections to the ruling political elite. A vivid sign of this phenomenon is the opening of the international casino in the Hotel Palana at a cost of $2 million. For me, though, the essence of these changes and of the globalization that has engulfed Maputo, if not yet all of Mozambique, is the giant Coca-Cola bottle painted on the side of the high-rise Prédio Joia on Avenida Julius Nyerere that looms over this wealthy part of Maputo. And I'm told by a friend that Beira features a giant statue of a Coke bottle in one of its central roundabouts. Nevertheless, I think we should be encouraged that at the end of 1997, President Chissano emphasized that the alleviation of poverty was Mozambique's priority for 1998, and that, quote, "the government would continue its activities to develop the rural areas as well as the improvement and extension of education and health care." But the road to hoe is rocky. In early July, President Chissano observed, quote, "with the increase of activities that respect no borders, particularly economic activities, a large and growing number of decisions vitally important for our lives are being taken in distant places, often by anonymous forces and agents that it is difficult for us to control," declaring the structural adjustment had negative impacts, quote, "which make poverty and social instability an effective obstacle to genuine popular participation in the democratic system," end quote. Structural adjustment signifies a radical departure from the economic policies pursued by Mozambique since independence. It seems to me, however, that Mozambique's economic transformation under the terms of structural adjustment has not thus far benefited most Mozambicans. The macroeconomic indicators I cited earlier, even if sustained into the future, do not by themselves constitute a social policy that promises to improve their lot. If Mozambique continues down this path without implementing the kinds of social policy expenditures promised by President Chissano, I fear the consequences of the widening gap between rich and poor. Just as Mozambique has gained international recognition as a model of economic reform, it has gained no less renown for its transition to multi-party democracy, my second theme. In particular, Mozambique is seen as the United Nations' great peacekeeping story in Africa, following the disaster it experienced in Angola and its inability to intervene successfully in the Great Lakes crisis. Let's look at the two elections that have been held in Mozambique since the Rome Peace Accord of 1992 to see whether or not this chorus of praise is justified. One of the biggest challenges facing Mozambique since gaining independence has been the search for national unity and the threat of ethnic rivalry. During the liberation struggle, Frelimo had adopted the political line to die a tribe and be born a nation. But as the party consolidated its hold over independent Mozambique, its enthusiasm for gaining national unity caused it to disregard the historical reality of language and culture. Combined with heavy-handed statist policies and uneven geographical distribution of the fruits of independence, Frelimo's insensitivity to ethnicity provided plenty of fodder for exploitation by its enemies, both internal and external, and John's spoken to some of that. The regionalist and ethnic politics of Renamo, the main opposition to Frelimo, were therefore a great worry to UNAMOS, the United Nations peacekeeping operation in Mozambique, and to other international observers as the first multi-party democratic elections approached in late October 1994. Yet despite various problems leading up to the elections, including a last-minute threatened boycott by Renamo, the election was by all accounts genuinely free and fair. More than 6 million voters registered nationally, and participation in the presidential election was 88%. Results showed clear signs of vote splitting, with Joaquim Chissano drawing 53% of the vote for president, but Frelimo candidates only 44% of the votes for the National Assembly, while Renamo candidates fared slightly better at the polls than did their presidential candidate, Afonso Dhlakama. The final tally yielded 129 seats for Frelimo, 112 for Renamo, and 9 for the Democratic Union, a coalition of smaller parties in parliament. Although the rural vote was fairly evenly divided, distinct regional patterns emerged in the elections, with Renamo controlling 5 provinces, while Frelimo garnered a majority of the urban vote. Summing up the results, Hanlon concludes that, quote, although there was a lot of talk of ethnic divisions, economic and social ones seemed more important, with Renamo gaining the support of poorer, more traditional, more rural people, while Frelimo had the backing of the relatively better off, more modernized, and more urban, end quote. This year's municipal elections, however, as we've heard, in which 23 cities and 10 towns elected new municipal councils, show a marked contrast. Renamo prevaricated and threatened to boycott the elections so that the government was forced into delaying them for almost a whole year. Despite attempts to accommodate Renamo, Party President Dhlakama ultimately pulled out. Renamo offered no candidates for election and urged voters to boycott the entire process as being illegitimate and inherently undemocratic, since it now did not include candidates of the leading opposition party. Among diplomatic representatives in Maputo, only the United States, people were asking what we do, only the United States bought this line, withdrawing its support for the elections. All other countries, tired of Renamo's history of negative politics and electoral disruption, stayed with the process. Except for the fact that the June 30th elections went off peacefully, they were otherwise discouraging and signal a major setback for democracy in Mozambique for several reasons. First, only 14.5% of all eligible voters went to the polls, with turnout less than 6% in one provincial capital, that was Quelimane. Even in Maputo, where the Frelimo candidate for mayor was challenged by two strong independent candidates, only 13% of eligible voters turned out. Second, the organization was disastrous and raises major concerns for the forthcoming 1999 national elections. Third, the cost of this election was exorbitantly high and suggests that Mozambique may have difficulty justifying such costs in the future, especially when the system itself is so badly managed. According to one analysis, these elections were the most expensive in the world. Fourth and finally, although we must certainly wait to see how the new municipal councils and presidents, as the mayors are called, function in practice, the fact is that Frelimo controls every single one of the 33 new councils, running unopposed in all but 6, and every presidency for which 19 of its candidates face no opposition. This does not bode well for multi-party democracy. The editors of Mozambique newspaper Medical worry that, quote, the single-party forces within Frelimo are seriously reinforced, not as a result of Frelimo's actions, but as a consequence of the so-called opposition parties, especially Renamo. While United States Ambassador Brian Curran laments that, quote, the absence of greater political participation in the municipal elections prejudices the international image of Mozambique. But more importantly, even President Chissano admits that the disappointing participation in the elections must be considered, quote, a stain on the process of democracy. And that's a pretty heavy, short quote. The big question is, why did people not vote? Most commentators consider that while the Renamo boycott had some impact, it does not begin to explain the extraordinary level of abstention, nor does mere apathy. Lack of civic education appears to have contributed to the poor results, as many potential voters apparently did not understand what was at stake in these elections, although the low turnout in politically aware Maputo would seem to belie this explanation. In their usual uncompromising fashion, the editors of Medical called it, quote, a vote against the system, which they claim is seriously discredited. They assign most of the blame, however, to the National Assembly, that is where people were elected in the election, quote, and its spectacle of operational irrelevance and predilection for the trappings of office that characterized the past 3 years. According to AWEPA, the European Parliamentarians for Southern Africa, quote, a commonly heard comment of people who did not vote was, we voted in 1994 and it did not make any difference. Our lives have not improved. Economic issues and corruption were often cited. The elite has prospered, but the people feel poorer. For many people, they continue, abstention was a conscious political act. It was not support for the boycott, but rather a rejection of all political parties. This was a sophisticated use of the democratic process in which the people voted no. It was a message to the political elite that the people were withdrawing their backing from an electoral process that had not brought them any gains, end quote. Nevertheless, if party politics has let the people of Mozambique down, for which both Frelimo and Renamo share responsibility, one positive development that merits watching is the emergence of several groups of important independent candidates and their coalitions who may well be harbingers for the future. Multi-party democracy represents another major reinvention of politics in Mozambique. As the incumbent government, with well-deserved historic claims to leadership and the national liberation struggle, from the national liberation struggle and an established political organization, Frelimo is willing to submit itself to democratic elections. Nevertheless, it seems to me that Frelimo has become used to holding exclusive power and sees no reason to share it with Renamo, its mortal enemy during the war that only ended in 1992, or with any other claimant to political leadership. And this attitude is antithetical to the flourishing of healthy multi-party democracy in Mozambique. Renamo, on the other hand, clearly has not succeeded in transforming itself from a guerrilla army into a political party that can contest elections on a regular basis. Its attempt to extend the terms of the 1992 Rome Peace Accord from the 1994 national elections to the 1998 municipal elections suggests that it cannot yet compete politically without support from the international community and guarantees of a place at the table. Whatever one thinks of the specific politics of Frelimo and Renamo, there needs to be a domestic resolution of their current differences. Thus, the results of the 1998 municipal elections indicate that if electoral democracy is to flourish in Mozambique, something needs to be done to find a productive way forward. And now a couple of concluding thoughts. This afternoon, I've focused my talk on two broad topics of national development in contemporary Mozambique: structural adjustment and multi-party democracy. But I do not want you to think that these are the only areas where Mozambique is reinventing itself. While it remains a member of a reconfigured international group of nations linked by the Portuguese language, in the 1990s, Mozambique has become a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, which reinforces the emergence of South Africa as its most important investor and its integration into the regional economy of Anglophone Southern Africa. Similarly, while it is struggling to come to grips with its significant Muslim population, Mozambique has also joined the Organization of the Islamic Conference. So there's a lot going on besides these two things. So the question remains, can Mozambique reinvent itself? I think it can. After all, the United States significantly reconceived itself as a consequence of the Civil War, and that monumental conflict took place during the 9th decade of our independence. Nor for all our national wealth and high standard of living have we succeeded in eradicating poverty or social injustice in this country. By our standards, Mozambique is still experiencing its youthful first steps. But Mozambique stands at a critical crossroads, though not for the first time in its history. As Mozambique approaches the 21st century, her people have earned the right to a secure future that promises them the fruits of their historic struggles. Surely, no one can doubt that the goals of social justice for all, to which Eduardo Mondlane dedicated his life, are still worth the struggle. While I remain personally skeptical of IMF and World Bank structural adjustment policies, and am disheartened by the results of the recent municipal elections, the example of Eduardo Mondlane and the ordinary people of Mozambique, who confronted and overcame equally daunting challenges in the past, continues to give me hope for the future. Thank you very much.